So my name is Bradley Pitts. I'm the chair of the Town of Copake's Mohican Allyship Committee. And before we get started, I'd like to read the Mohican Allyship Committee's land acknowledgement. In the spirit of healing, growth, and hope, with gratitude and humility, the Mohican Allyship Committee acknowledges that we are learning, speaking, and living on the unceded homelands of the Mohican or Mohican people, the people of the waters that are never still, or the indigenous peoples of this land. We acknowledge that the Mohican people, along with many indigenous nations, were subject to genocide, coerced into assimilation, and forcibly removed from their homelands so that settlers and their descendants might live here without them. Despite these tremendous hardships and repeated forced removals, today the Mohican Nation is part of the Stockbridge-Munsee community in Wisconsin, a federally recognized sovereign nation. We celebrate the continuing presence of the Stockbridge-Munsee here in their homelands and throughout the Mohican diaspora. And through our actions and words, the Mohican Allyship Committee seeks to pay honor and respect to the Stockbridge-Munsee ancestors and elders as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. So today I'll be discussing this land acknowledgement in depth and sharing a bit about how I came to this work. But first I'd like to thank the Roe Jan Historical Society for hosting us, the town's bicentennial committee for inviting us into the celebrations, and Jean Metler, Richard Wolf, and the town board for supporting the formation and the mission of the committee. As was said, April 4th marks the 200th anniversary of the founding of the town of Copake, and it's significant and meaningful that the town wants to acknowledge and hold space for a shared reflection on the history of this place and its people, as well as the relationships we have inherited with the Mohicans and their descendants. Thank you. Before we begin, I'd also like to point out I'm no expert in this work. I am not a historian. I do not have any Mohican ancestry. I am not a member of the Mohican Nation, and I have no authority to speak on their behalf. The vast majority of what I'll present today is taken directly from Stockbridge-Munsee community materials, and I will do my best to cite my sources throughout. I was greatly hoping that the Stockbridge-Munsee representative could give this presentation, but unfortunately, due to scheduling, the calendars didn't work out, so I'm on the hook. I'm here to relay publicly available information, not present new research. A little bit about how I came to this work. I began this journey 3 years ago with little to no knowledge of the Mohicans, and I've made plenty of embarrassing mistakes along the way. Part of the committee's role is to try to keep you all from making the mistakes I've made already. But I've kept at it, checking that my intentions are true and trusting that with time that would become apparent. This work is often uncomfortable and always complex, requiring us to move at the speed of trust. I have found that the more I learn and get involved with this work, the more intricate and nuanced it becomes. As a European descendant, I now feel that if you are working on indigenous issues and you feel you have a clear handle on it, you're probably missing something. Thank you for being here today and opening yourselves up to the complexity and likely discomfort. I hope you will find, as I have, that it is highly rewarding. So in order to set the tone for the presentation, I want to start with a poem, and I offer this as much as a reminder to myself as an invitation to you. So, An Invitation to Brave Space by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. Together, we will create brave space, because there's no such thing as safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars, and we all have caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other in to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. So a quick outline of today's presentation. I'll give you a quick introduction to the Mohican Allyship Committee. current Stockbridge-Muncie community and their priorities here in the homelands, which translates to opportunities for allies here in the homelands, and then share some additional resources. So first, the committee. As was just mentioned, the committee was born out of a motion that I made to the town board in 2023 in response to town interest in the old Niagara farm, which I'll speak a little bit about. The town board unanimously approved the committee in February, and we formed a working group with some volunteers. In December, the mission statement was adopted by the town board. In January, we had a public call for volunteers to apply if they were interested in the committee. Members were appointed in February, and our current members are myself as the chair, Rita Jabukowski as the secretary, Catherine Mickich, and Dan House as the Conservation Advisory Committee liaison. This is taken directly from our mission statement. As a subcommittee of the Conservation Advisory Committee, the Mohican Allyship Committee shall further the cultural mission of the CAC by engaging in the activities listed below. In addition, the MAC shall collaborate with the town historian on historian activities concerning the indigenous people of the Copake area. Like the CAC, the MAC's role in town decisions and policy making is advisory only. So our activities include working with the town of Copake and area residents in consultation with Stockbridge-Muncie community representatives to increase the visibility and understanding of contemporary, past, and future Mohicans in order to honor them. We facilitate intergovernment communications between the town and the Stockbridge-Muncie community about any and all town activities related to the indigenous inhabitants of the greater Copake area and their descendants, including any references to Mohicans, past, present, and future. And we provide recommendations for local policies, procedures, and resolutions related to the town's relationship with the Stockbridge-Muncie community, their ancestors, and descendants. So the committee is primarily dedicated to contemporary Mohican descendants, as they rightfully should lead the narrative of their culture and people, past, present, and future. Our process is to always seek input from the Stockbridge-Muncie representatives, acknowledging that they are a sovereign governing body whose core responsibility is to serve their tribal citizens first. Given the sovereignty and responsibility of the Stockbridge-Muncie community, we recognize that our and the town's timeline is not the Stockbridge-Muncie community's timeline. And in order to build ongoing meaningful ally relationships with them, we try to move at the speed of trust. We do this by informing ourselves as much as possible with publicly available resources before asking for any input from the Stockbridge-Muncie representatives, and by waiting for official input before moving ahead. In our official capacity as advisors to the town, we always advocate for Stockbridge-Muncie sovereign interests, making recommendations to the town, its agencies, and its residents as necessary. And we have this note as part of our mission statement, that the mission statement is aspirational, it's a guiding document for the committee, but all mentions of the Stockbridge-Muncie community refer to our intentions and principles and are in no way meant to suggest a formal agreement with Stockbridge-Muncie community. You might hear me say SMC. SMC is Stockbridge-Muncie community. We have shared this mission with the Stockbridge-Muncie Tribal Council. As I said earlier, they have their own timeline, but we hope they'll give us feedback and or approve it. Current projects are developing a land acknowledgement to be read before the official opening of the bicentennial. Working with the town historian, conservation advisory committee, historic preservation committee, and town board to respectfully care for artifacts that were discovered in town in 2014. And we're working towards organizing a reading circle of Becoming Kin, which is a book I'll be quoting a lot from today. So the land acknowledgement movement. How many folks have been at an event in which a land acknowledgement has been read? Okay, great. So So land acknowledgements are formal statements that acknowledge the original peoples of the land spoken at the beginning of public events. It's a traditional practice that dates back many centuries in indigenous cultures, but here it took off in 2020 with many institutions doing it earlier. But 2020 is actually when I think I first encountered land acknowledgements. And as it says here, what I consider kind of a first wave of land acknowledgements acknowledged the history, but generated a criticism that they were kind of tokenistic or lip service. As much as that may be the case, I would not be here giving this presentation if it wasn't for land acknowledgements. They really called me into this awareness and work. I'd say currently we're in a kind of second wave of land acknowledgements that promote action, and sometimes these sorts of land acknowledgements are referred to as living land acknowledgements. So from Becoming Kin, Patty Crowick says, at best, land acknowledgements recognize relationships, the price that indigenous people have paid for the existence of this place, and reflect on tangible things people can do. Land acknowledgements are a moment to pause and reflect on the relationship that exists between the current residents and those who were displaced. What does it mean to live on stolen land? You may not be guilty of the act of dispossession, but it is a relationship that you have inherited. And as I'll say more about, I find this work incredibly hopeful and just a huge realm of possibility. So I'll now return to the MAC land acknowledgement as a structure to talk about history and present. So in our land acknowledgement, we start with the spirit of healing, growth, and hope, with gratitude and humility. The Mohican Allyship Committee acknowledges that we're learning, speaking, and living on the unceded homelands of the Mohican or Mohican people. The part I really want to focus on is the homelands of the Mohican or Mohican people. So here's an image from the Stockbridge Munsee about their homelands. I'll use my crutch. This area here is the Mohican homelands. The bottom lobe down here is part of the Lenape homelands. I'll speak a little bit about that, but as we'll learn, Stockbridge, in the name Stockbridge Munsee, is mostly referring to the Mohican homelands. Munsee is referring to Lenape, and due to all the disruption caused by European arrival, the two groups arrived together to form the Stockbridge Munsee community. So there are several Lenape nations in the States and some in Canada. Stockbridge Munsee is the only nation of Mohican descendants. If that makes sense. So the original people of the Hudson Valley, from Roe Jan watershed to Lake Champlain, the Housatonic to the Delaware River valleys, are the Mohican or Mohican people, the people of the waters that are never still. But I do want to quickly rethink this representation of the homelands. The outline of the current state borders is helpful for orientation, but clearly it's anachronistic when talking about indigenous homelands. We might be tempted to look at images like this for greater accuracy, but unfortunately this too easily suggests the idea of empty wilderness, and as Patrick Wolf notes in Traces of History, there is no such thing as wilderness, only depopulation. So instead I prefer using a map of the indigenous homelands here on Turtle Island, otherwise known as North America. Here we see the territories occupied by the multitude of indigenous nations throughout the continent, as documented by the website Native Land Digital. I'll be sharing links at the end that include links to all these sources, and if I miss something, I'll be sharing an email so you can pester me about it. Here's the multitude of languages that were spoken in 1491. Of course, this is zoomed out. If we zoom into specific areas, you'll see even more diversity. And here we are back at the homelands, highlighted in yellow. surrounded by their neighboring tribes. For orientation, here's the state borders and some of the major waterways. But I want to stay with this map as the base map. So the pamphlet, A Brief History of the Mohican Nation by Dorothy David, starts with a relating of the Mohican origin story. Quote, "A great people traveled from the north and west. They crossed waters where the land almost touched. For many, many years they moved across the land, leaving settlements in rich river valleys as others moved on." As a footnote, the text says, "What is meant by the north and west and waters where land nearly touched is not known. The Bering Strait theory is questionable based on current research." So to continue with the quote, "Reaching the eastern edge of the country, some of these people, called the Lene Lenape, chose to settle on a river later named the Delaware. Others moved north and settled in the valley of a river where the waters, like those in their original homeland, were never still. They named this river the Mohicanituck and called themselves the Mohicaniup, the people of the waters that are never still. The name evolved through several spellings. Today, however, they are known as the Mohicans. Because the Mohican people chose to build their homes near rivers where they would be close to food, water, and transportation, they were sometimes called river Indians. The Mohicans never forgot that they were relatives of many other tribes who had traveled with them over the centuries. Mohican leaders often sent warriors to assist their allies when they were in danger of being attacked. But these were temporary alliances and did not result in a powerful confederacy such as the Haudenosaunee, or what some of us might have been told to call them Iroquois. Iroquois is a French name, we can talk about that, but end quote. Here's a two-scale timeline. On the left are footprints from White Sands, New Mexico, currently thought to be the earliest evidence of human habitation on the continent. You can see that predates when the Bering Bridge was opened by multiple thousands of years. The earliest evidence of human presence in the Copake region, this is in Orange County, 10,560 BCE, during that period when the land bridge was opened. For reference, at the bottom, I've given you other kind of world events. So that was happening before the, quote, cradle of civilization in the Middle East and Asia, happening before the maize was first domesticated in southern Mexico. The earliest artifact found within Copake Township is around 4000 BCE, which predates the time the Great Pyramid was being built in Egypt. Of course, then we pass through 0 BCE. Here's when Henry Hudson sails up the Mohicanituck, and then the 200 years of Copake. So again, Patty Krewich points out, we have always been here. This is how we understand ourselves, and it is true. Even if we did migrate from somewhere else more than 100,000 years ago, our own creation stories are filled with migration and travel. But this land is where we emerged as peoples. This is where we developed our political systems and cosmologies. This is where we fell to earth, or emerged from the ground, or otherwise formed our identities as distinct peoples. So I hope that gives you a sense of why we say this is the Mohican homelands. Now there's this word, unceded. Why do we say that? So cessation is the assignment of property to another entity, usually by treaty. This law dictionary defines it as a surrender, a giving up, a relinquishment of jurisdiction by a board in favor of another agency. In contrast with annexation, where property is forcibly seized, cession is voluntarily given, or at least apparently so. So as you'll note from this map of cessation treaties throughout the continent, the entire eastern board is absent of such treaties. And here, circled, right, is the border between Robert Livingston's Claremont estate, they share this interesting history. So in 1686, Robert Livingston acquired 2,000 acres on the Hudson, that orange rectangle over there, and 600 acres at Bash Fish, I think where we're standing right now. Here I've put a dot around the rough outlines of Copake Township today. So then, by the stroke of a pen, in a quote, vaguely worded royal patent, which described the two parcels as adjacent, the original 2,600 acres became 160,000 acres. Apparently, the majority of Copake Township wasn't even purchased. But even in instances where there are quote-unquote purchases or deed transfer, there's plenty of reason these documents often are considered suspect. One of which is, of course, the tribal nations had their own laws, which Europeans were not adhering to. So imposing European ideas of deeds, etc., is out of their jurisdiction, we can say. Most sales were made under extreme duress, and there's no indigenous concept of land ownership, so there cannot be any informed consent. Bonnie Hartley, the Stockbridge-Muncie Historic Preservation Manager, has said, because of our traditional views of shared land ownership, our ancestors thought they were participating in a gift exchange and being hospitable to neighbors asking for use of land. They thought they could always return to the land. And this history plays out over and over again as you look at the indigenous experience of the continent. So the next sentence, we acknowledge that the Mohican people, along with many indigenous nations, were subject to genocide, coerced into assimilation, and forcibly removed from their homelands so settlers and their descendants might live here without them. So first I want to talk about the forcibly removed piece. So the history I'm going to share is greatly simplified. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go into all the details, but I highly recommend reading this pamphlet, A Brief History of the Mohican Nation by Dorothy Davis. There will be a link shared to this PDF, but the simplified version I'm sharing today comes from a website, The Long Journey Home, put together by the Stockbridge-Muncie and the Open Space Institute. So here we go. Here's 1491. Of course, the significance of that is 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The homelands, Mohican homelands. For reference again, state lines and some rivers. So in 1660, this is the state of the colonies. You'll see this area grow as you progress through time. As the colonies grew, trade disrupted and the established order between neighboring tribes, creating tensions between the Mohicans and the Mohawks to the west. Not to mention the displacement of coastal populations. So the Mohicans were basically getting squeezed from east and west. And the European settlements grew. In 1724, only two of the original villages were left along the Housatonic River in the Berkshires. One was Wanatucook, also known as the Great Meadow. This village was later renamed Stockbridge for village in England. In the 1730s, from New York Hudson's Valley, the Mohicans relocated to territory in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Here they became known as the Stockbridge Tribe. They set up homes and infrastructure, including a grist mill and schoolhouse. In the 1770s, though they fought on the side of the Americans in the Revolutionary War, the warriors returned home in diminished numbers to find that missionaries and settlers had taken over their land. Additionally, although the members of the Mohican Nation were supposed to have equal representation in local government, increasingly they were being excluded from key votes. Shortly after, they were removed from their Stockbridge-Muncie home. and the nation continued to grow. In the 1770s to the 1820s, members of the United Indian Nation invited the Stockbridge Munsee community to live on their New York lands in what became known as New Stockbridge, New York. Again, the Stockbridge Munsee community tried to put down roots, reconstructing a school, sowing crops, and building homes. Soon, however, tensions between non-Indians and Indians over the land began to build, and New York settlers began a series of illegal land grabs. In 1820, as settlement pressure increased in New York, a portion of the Mohican community struck west to land promised to them on the White River near Muncie, Indiana. Arriving in the new territory, they found the land had already been taken by American settlers. The community members, together with their Muncie relations, moved to rejoin the Stockbridge community in Wisconsin. In the 1820s to the 1850s, the remainder of the Stockbridge Mohican community secured lands in Wisconsin, moving 3 times until finally finding land in Shawano County, where the community resides today, more than 150 years later. Of course, this is also the period in which Copake held its first town board meeting in 1824. So this is what we might call the Stockbridge Munsee Community Trail of Tears. As I said, it's much more intricate. There's many waves of migration, but this just gives you a sense. And here we have a quote from 1854 by diplomat John Quinney. My friends, being invited to come here as a Mohican and now standing upon the soil which was once and now ought to be the property of this tribe, I have thought for once, and certainly the last time, I would shake you by the hand and ask you to listen for a little while to what I have to say. Where are the 25,000 in number and the 4,000 warriors who constituted the power and population of the great Mohican nation in 1604? It is curious, the history of my tribe, and its decline during the last 2 centuries and a half. Nothing that deserves the name of purchase was ever made. Let it not surprise you, my friends, when I say that the spot on which we stand has never been purchased or rightly obtained, and that by justice, human and divine, it is the property now of the remnant of that great people from whom I am descended. They left it in the tortures of starvation and to improve their miserable existence. These events are above our comprehension and for wise purposes. For myself and my tribe, I ask for justice. I believe it will sooner or later occur, and may the great and good spirit enable me to die in hope. So after this period, we have another period in local history, as written by Warren Broderick. In 1859, a group of Stockbridge Munsee traveled back from the reservation in Wisconsin to reclaim pieces of their homelands by taking up residence in 3 empty farms in Columbia County. This was part of a larger events at the time of called the Renters' Wars, but the Mohicans were coming back to reclaim their homelands. So one of these farms was actually the old Niver farm, whose house and barn still exist today. This has 23 running from right to left. The high school, Copake High School. So in between 11 and 7, there's the cemetery, and right next to the cemetery is as I understand, the original farmhouse and barn of the Niver farm where this event took place. Again, if it's not there now, I will share a link to that article for those that are interested. So this is yet another example of how the Mohicans have never ceded this land, nor lost interest in their homelands. In fact, they kept fighting for their right to their homelands despite the tremendous odds. Unfortunately, in this case, the grounds of the Mohicans' claims were never fully examined, and they were forcibly removed yet again to Wisconsin. Now we get to the words genocide and coerced into assimilation. Why do we say that? So we don't really have to look much further than the U.S. Department of Interior website where they say between 1819 through the 1970s, the United States implemented policies establishing and supporting Indian boarding schools across the nation. The purpose of federal Indian boarding schools was to culturally assimilate American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children by forcibly removing them from their families, communities, languages, religions, and cultural beliefs. While these children attended federal boarding schools, many endured physical and emotional abuse, and in some cases died. So I have here a brief list of U.S. laws toward Indians. In 1819, the Indian Civilization Act established Indian boarding schools. In 1869, the quote-unquote peace policy allowed religious groups to run reservations. In 1891, the Compulsory Indian Education Act allowed government to take Native children and put them in boarding schools. And the stated purpose of this policy was kill the Indian, save the man. I'm sure that's a phrase many of you heard before. In 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act was supposed to address a lot of this, but Indian children are almost twice as likely to be in foster care as white children. So if we compare that to the UN Genocide Convention definition of genocide, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, by killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within this group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So I hope that makes it clear why we use the term genocide and how, yeah, it's hard to argue. So the U.S. policy of indigenous erasure have had a devastating, long-lasting consequence that continues today. This dehumanizing and erasure has been internalized by the dominant culture of North America and perpetuated, inadvertently or not, by many of us. This is why we must be especially careful about our depictions and narratives of American Indians. So this is from an article on another crisis, current crisis in reservations and indigenous populations throughout. So the quote is, unique to indigenous peoples is the media portrayal of Native people in society. Because indigenous people make up only 1.7% of the population as of 2010, it is more likely that a person will encounter indigenous people in the media than they would in person. This makes media portrayal incredibly potent, as most non-indigenous people will not have their prototypical perception of indigenous people challenged by real-life experience with Native persons. Even positive portrayals tend to homogenize the identity of indigenous people, further diluting the diverse customs and cultural practices of American Indian tribes. This combination of devaluing and fictionalizing indigenous people leads society to do the same. What we do and say and how we do it and say it matters. Many of us are not vulnerable in this way, but due to the history of genocide and erasure of indigenous people, the stakes can be quite high for them. We must acknowledge and accept this and act accordingly. Next sentence. Despite tremendous hardships and repeated forced removals, today the Mohican Nation is part of the Stockbridge-Muncie community in Wisconsin, a federally recognized sovereign nation. So this is a map of Wisconsin with the Stockbridge-Muncie community circled. This kind of rectangle, you can see that there's a square here where the corner's been cut out. That square is the Menominee Nation. I always find it shocking but not surprising, as they say, that it was another tribal nation that gave the Stockbridge-Muncie their land. It wasn't the government. But of course, all this land was occupied anyway, so even if the government had given them their lands, it would have been someone else's homelands. So this is a quote from Heather Brugel, a first-line descendant, Stockbridge Munsee. Today, a vibrant community resides in Fowler, Wisconsin, on reservation land secured in 1856. A strong tribal government leads our community. Our language and culture remain vibrant on this land, where we keep our history alive too. Since those first changes came in 1609 with the arrival of Hudson, my ancestors survived removal, near erasure, both physical and cultural, through myths like that of James Fenimore Cooper, so that I am able to tell their story. Their sacrifices made it possible for me to flourish, and for this reason I will forever be grateful. We continue to forge new paths. Mohican Nation survives. My family and I had the great pleasure to go out to the Stockbridge Munsee Reservation last summer. The built environment, I think, would feel very familiar to you. It's not that different from Copake, a little more spread out, perhaps. But these are some of the municipal buildings. They have a beautiful fairgrounds where they host their powwow, which my family attended. It was a really moving experience. I just want to share some images of where they are today. And some facts. So there's about 1,500 enrolled members, a third of them living on the reservation. The tribal council is made up of 6 elected members. There's 5 tribal business enterprises, 866 employees, the largest employer in Toronto County, 2 official languages, Mohican and Munsee, 58 traditional medicines in use, 500,000 annual scholarships, education scholarships. They have 24,000 acres of lands in trust, and they're still acquiring lands originally promised in past treaties. There's 16,000 acres of the tribe lands are forested, and $3.5 million is contributed annually to universal health care for tribal members and surrounding communities. Finally, we get to this last section. We celebrate the continuing presence of the Stockbridge Munsee here in their homelands and throughout the Mohican diaspora. And through our actions and words, the Mohican Allyship Committee seeks to pay honor and respect to Stockbridge Munsee ancestors and elders as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. This is the crux, through our actions and our words. So Patty Crouch reminds us, we must move from recognizing the fact of our relationship to actually existing together in reciprocal relationships. And the president of Stockbridge Munsee said, we always maintained a relationship with our homelands because our ancestors are still here. So current priorities for the Stockbridge Munsee and the homelands. Their Tribal Historic Preservation Office, which actually is located at Williams College. So the only representative that's officially based in the homelands is the Historic Preservation Manager. But their mission is to protect Mohican and Munsee cultural sites and burial places, and repatriate cultural items and return ancestors held by museums or other institutions for respectful burial. Much of this is guided by federal regulation, but as they point out, much repatriation work remains to be done at the individual level. And this is where we all come in. Their website includes a site and artifact reporting form, which will be shared as many of the links, in which you can submit any artifacts that might be of interest to them. This is the map they give for their areas of interest. As you can see, they correspond quite well to the homelands. And of course, Columbia County, we all know where that is. But yeah, we are an area of interest. So some of the legal frameworks on the federal level, there's the National Historic Preservation Act, which requires federal agencies to consult with Indian tribes on historic properties of religious and cultural significance. There's the National American Graves and Repatriation Act, which you might have read about recently in the news. It was just updated earlier this year. But it's talking about projects using federal funds must repatriate or transfer Native American human remains and other cultural items to the appropriate parties within the next 5 years. And in New York State, last year they just passed the Unmarked Burial Site Protection Act, which regulates the treatment of artifacts found on private land. When that passed, we were one of only 4 states in the nation that had no laws pertaining to the artifacts found on private land. So I'm glad we are catching up. These are the legal frameworks we are all required to abide by. But as individuals and a community, we can choose to abide. As individuals and a community, we can choose to abide by these laws. For example, whether our project receives federal funds or not. Some townships are enacting local ordinances to require just that. In several documents on the Stockbridge-Muncie website, they share the cultural and ethical standards they ask us to abide by. So I'm going to share some of those. So this is the policy they share for treatment of items that might be discovered inadvertently. Of course, they ask that we contact the community immediately, but no later than 3 days after the discovery. They ask that we place tobacco and human remains and with the human remains or funeral objects. Cover the remains and funeral objects with a natural fiber cloth, such as cotton or muslin when possible. Do not take photographs. Leave them in situ and protect them from further disturbance. And documentation of the remains and cultural items shall be carried out only in consultation with the tribe. If the remains and cultural items are to remain in situ, of course there's laws that need to be followed. Do not disclose the locations of discovery, of course with the exception of local officials. If the remains and funeral objects are to be removed from the site, there's specific procedures and considerations determined by the Stockbridge-Muncie community in consultation with federal agency. So I read this document and I hear the Stockbridge-Muncie telling us explicitly what they would consider respectful treatment of these items and what they're asking of us, above and beyond the letter of the law. It's up to each of us to show them respect and care by abiding by their requests. They also share this archaeological ethics for field schools pamphlet, and they further highlight what is ethical, respectful behavior. As per the American Anthropological Association Statement on Ethics, ethical obligations should supersede the goal of seeking new knowledge, as well as sponsor or client requests. And the ethics require open communication with tribal nations, including on project design, research objectives, and plans for discovered artifacts. Further, they ask us to always remember that archaeology can and does impact living communities, similar to the impact of media depictions mentioned earlier. They ask us to prioritize relationships, and I hope you're hearing the echo of that word, relationships, because that's what it's all about. They ask us to understand the historical context of fieldwork, including colonialism, genocide, tribal history, and culture. They ask that we center Native voices, be respectful to indigenous needs, sensibilities, histories, and perspectives. They ask that the protocols for the discovery of human remains should be established in conjunction with existing law, of course, and Stockbridge-Muncie should receive informed consent and other ethical considerations. Again, these requests go above and beyond what is strictly required by law, but they give us an opportunity to put real action behind our words of honor and respect. There's also this beautiful guide, Repatriation in You, that deals with baskets, weavings, and other personal items. That it says, it is invaluable to Stockbridge-Muncie citizens to welcome home lost objects and ancestors. A grandmother's necklace, a great-aunt's basket, the moccasins of an ancestor. Every return is another small, tender victory. We have had individuals realize one day that they were in possession of lost objects, and out of respect and care decided to return the objects to the Stockbridge-Muncie, home to their people. This booklet was born from stories of community members doing the right thing. These practices go a long way towards restoring invaluable elements of our cultural identity. Unfortunately, I don't have time to take you through the whole pamphlet, but the link will be shared. And this last page of the pamphlet gives you an example of some of the aesthetics and techniques that might indicate Mohican origins. Of course, if you or anyone you know is in possession of such an item and want to return it, this is the email address for the Historic Preservation Office. So how many folks have heard the term land back? Okay. So again, Patty Crouch. We cannot talk about restoring our relationship to the land without talking about restoring the land to relationship with the people from whom it was taken. Unable to imagine any scenario other than what settler colonialism unleashed on us, people assume that land back means evictions, relocations, and elimination. But wholesale eviction was never what we intended. Remember, from the earliest treaties, we offered a way to live together in peace, friendship, and respect. So I want to take you, well, first, I'll take you through a few examples of land back, but here's some quotes directly from Stockbridge Muncie. Bonnie Hartley again. Our land is intrinsic to who we are. It is our identity. The greatest gift is to have our land back. And Shannon Holsey, the president, says, the Stockbridge Muncie are not trying to reclaim land from ownership in a Western colonial way of thinking about it. We are trying to reclaim our ways of being, which was never based on money. It was the reclamation of our kinship systems, our governance systems, our ceremony and spirituality, our language, our culture, and our food and medicinal systems. Those are all based on our relationship to the land. It's also about stewardship and making sure we retain the historical significance of this homeland and making sure that we do whatever we can in a collaborative way to protect it for future generations. So here's some recent examples of land being returned to the Stockbridge Muncie. Papscani Island. You can see where it's located here on the Hudson, just south of Albany, I believe, and in relation to the original Mohican homelands. Here's a detail with some of the trails. So in 1637, the Mohican community transferred ownership of Papscani Island to a Dutch merchant. It, of course, passed through many hands until in the 1990s, Open Space Institute purchased the property, creating a 156-acre Papscani Island Nature Preserve, and they started collaborating with the Stockbridge Muncie community. Just in 2021, ownership was transferred to the Stockbridge Muncie community, and an arrangement with the Rensselaer County and Rensselaer Land Trust will keep the trails maintained and open for the public enjoyment. And then just this year, the island was registered on the National Register of Historic Places and designated a traditional cultural property. Open Institute President Kim Ellman said, while we recognize that our human histories and experiences are dramatically different, our love and careful stewardship of Papscani Island is shared with the Mohican Nation. The Open Space Institute's return of the property is a celebration and acknowledgement of the Stockbridge Muncie community's rich history, cultural resilience, and land stewardship during and beyond this important moment of historical reckoning. So far from taking anything away from current residents, I would argue the return of land greatly enriches the experience of anyone visiting the Papscani Island Nature Preserve. I'm sorry to say I have not been there yet myself, but it's on my list. And then in 2023, you might have read about the return of some land on Monument Mountain, which is on the way to Stockbridge, and they have worked closely with the Stockbridge Muncie on the signage, so I highly recommend a visit. They acquired 351 acres on the north slope of Monument Mountain with a $2.6 million grant from Massachusetts State. And the land is going to be used for implementing tribal conservation and forest management strategies to combat climate change. Again, the Stockbridge Muncie are using this return of their land for communal good. So land back is a spectrum. It doesn't mean always the wholesale transfer of ownership back to the tribe. This is a kind of menu, if you will, provided by the law firm Conservation Partners and describes the legal framework for each of these options, from the wholesale transfer of ownership to different easement arrangements. Again, the link will be provided, but, you know, as I said, there's a spectrum. There's the transferring ownership, there's different easements, and then at the very end, in parentheses, I added this last one, which in various circles that I've been in has suggested that, you know, maybe the most simplest act is the private land stewardship. And by planting native food and medicinal plants, that's another way of starting to build, you know, a land acknowledgement and do honor to the Stockbridge Munsee. And then, of course, there's financial donations. So this link will take you to a site where the Stockbridge Munsee are asking for funds to help rebuild their cultural center. So we end with this statement: we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. And I want to note that this language is taken directly from the land acknowledgement language that the Stockbridge Munsee community recommends. Again, this allyship work is much bigger than any one group, and it heals us all. It's also why we start the land acknowledgement by saying, in the spirit of healing, growth, and hope. The question has never been whether we are related, but how we live out these relationships with the land and with other than human relatives and with each other. Ultimately, what we inherit are relationships and our beliefs about them. We can't alter the actions of our ancestors, but we can decide what we do with the social relations they left us. So I don't know about you, but I find this incredibly uplifting and empowering. Land acknowledgements are not about making anyone feel guilty. Like any inventory, they help us get clear on the facts so that we can actively choose how we want to move forward. As I said earlier, they give us the opportunity to bring our lives into greater alignment with our principles and priorities. So by being here today, you've already taken an action to raise awareness of the Mohicans, past, present, and future. Please share what you've learned with your friends, family, and community, and help us call others into this awareness. The role of the Mohican Allyship Committee is to help in whatever ways we can. Finally, I want to just share some additional resources. If you haven't been in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, the Mission House has been doing a lot of work in collaboration with the Stockbridge Munsee, and they have an exhibition called the Mohican Miles. It's very much worth a visit. They also provide a walking tour, Mohican walking tour of Stockbridge as a pamphlet. Oh, sorry, and I'll just say they do a lot of public programming where they bring folks from Wisconsin to give presentations. Again, there will be links provided. Rethinking Place is an amazing initiative at Bard College. They're partnered closely with the Stockbridge Munsee community and are doing great work, including public programming. The Forge project is just down the road off of 82 towards Hudson. And while they're not specifically a Mohican organization, they are Indigenous-led and have a great public program calendar on various Indigenous initiatives. This field you see in the front, they've been slowly planting Indigenous crops with Indigenous farming methods, and often they'll have work days where you can go in and take part. And the three main links I want to present, the top one is the website for the Stockbridge Munsee community, again the donation link, and all the links that I've mentioned throughout this presentation will be available through that last link. I will try to remember which, oh yeah, the Broderick article about the Niver farm I will put up this afternoon after the presentation. So that's the presentation. Please email me if you'd be interested in participating in a group reading of Becoming Kin. and or if you have any questions about the Mohican Allyship Committee's work. Thanks again for being here. I think there's time for questions before the reception. So, if anybody has, I'll do my best to answer. Yes, sir.
This is not a question, but a comment, and that is, we had the fortune of visiting the Pequot Museum at Foxwoods in southeastern Connecticut. And let me tell you, that is over the top, first-class museum. If you get a chance, I highly recommend that you visit it.
Thank you.
Massachusetts Pequot. That's obviously a tribal.
Thank you. Howard, yeah.
There's a 3 to 5 acre parcel that was offered last year to the town.
Right.
And the board didn't seem to have any idea of what they might do with it. I brought it back to Richard, so talked to Richard about that, Rich Wolf,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah, we'll see.
okay?
I have this on second-hand information, which is always, tenuous to rely on. But like all of us, right, the Stockbridge Muncie community has limited bandwidth here in Wisconsin. So when it comes to land back, often they have to prioritize sites that have significant cultural interest, and as I shared, especially with Papscani Island, often these arrangements include a local conservation organization that's managing the land. So lands that are not significant culturally, historically to them, even if in the homelands, it's not a huge priority. I think it's always worth offering. But I think in terms of real meaningful action we can take here is kind of abiding by the request and care for artifacts and remains and the things I presented. There's much more on their website, and it's a much bigger conversation, but there's a huge opportunity to do good. Yeah.
How many people live on the reservation in Wisconsin?
Yeah, so the enrolled members are about 1,500, and I think a third of them live on the reservation. Yeah, that's right.
Is there a population of the Mohican people, like we know how many? Not just 1,500 that's on the reservation, but
No, so 1,500 is nationally enrolled members, and remember, Stockbridge Muncie includes the Nape descendant as well as Mohican descendant. I will say, as I said, it's all complicated, but because of this displacement, everything, folks usually have multiple, as do all of us, have multiple ancestry lines, right? And there are different reasons why someone might choose to be a registered member of X nation, even though they would also qualify for Y. So I don't think it's fair to say there's 1,500 Mohican descendants. There's more.
right,
But
that's
in terms of enrolled membership, yes. Yes.
Any info available on the status of the Mohican thermal spring in Lebanon Spring?
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about it. Yeah. Yes.
Is your land acknowledgement on one of your websites?
I can put it there. Yeah.
And also at the Jacob's Pillow in June, there'll be a Mohican storyteller on the
Okay.
outdoor performance, just for one day, I think, on
Yes.
like June 26th or something.
Oh, that reminds me, there's also in the Berkshires, there's an organization called the Alliance for a Viable Future and Beyond. They do a lot of public programming with speakers from Wisconsin. Yeah, so there's a lot out there if you look, but unfortunately it doesn't get the visibility I believe it deserves. Yeah. Yes.
There's a number of municipalities
I'm new to town government and don't know the full implications of the conservation plan work. But I think, sharing these resources and starting the conversation is the way to get there. Again, this book, Becoming Kin, I think is just kind of the book that I know of thus far that is an amazing way to start the conversation, and each chapter ends with questions or actions that the author is asking us to consider. So it's action focused, not just describing issues.
I just want to point out that in the front showcases here, we have copies of these books for you
Yes.
to see and information about them.
And one of the links that I'm sharing of the Stockbridge Muncie is recommended reading lists. They provide a recommended reading list. I think we have printouts of the list. They are just in a display, maybe.
I printed out in that, yes.
Yeah. So again, they are helping us all educate ourselves, and unfortunately, if you're like me, you have a lot of work to do. This was not material I was educated with. So there's a lot of unlearning, a lot of relearning, and a lot of new learning. Yeah.
What sparked your personal interest?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Like I said, in 2020, I was in several spaces that started using land acknowledgements, and it kind of, it hit me square between the eyes. It was also when we purchased our property here in Copake. I have family history that includes missionary work in far-off places, and I've been interested in indigenous people elsewhere, but the land acknowledgement movement really brought me into awareness of like, oh, of course, right? There are people here. I don't have to dream about if only I could visit the Amazon. Like they're here, right? So that started it. I also started learning the history of my own ancestry, which is Scottish, as the majority from what I know. And I'm sure in all your ancestry history, there's plenty of history of being oppressed, colonized by Roman forces, by, you name it. And then often the oppressed become the oppressors. So, I started feeling the personal grief and loss of the history and stories and cultures that I don't have access to because of these colonial histories. And so I feel like that's really important work for those of us that are European descendants to understand our skin in the game. This is work I don't do for the Stockbridge Muncie. I do it for myself, for my kids, because I want these relationships. I think to just do it for them would be a bit paternalistic. So yeah, I think as I've become more in touch with the loss and the grief that I feel in terms of my family history, it's motivated me to want to protect, that from happening even further to other people. So yeah, that's where I think of. This happens to be the plaid of my Scottish clan. Yes.
I'm also on the board of the president of Copake State Park, and of course, Copake State Park is the best access to Backbridge Falls.
Yes.
So we've been working, we're on national, all different kinds of historic groups and sites over here. It's been frustrating working with the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation in terms of getting signage changed
Yeah.
and updated. Some of our signage is really pretty bad. Referring to the myth, the legend of Backbridge Falls.
Right.
Maybe you haven't been to the falls and stuff. So I just want to caution people that some of this moves very, very slow.
Very slow. Yeah. Yeah. I'll just say that part of my education in this work has been a lot of us, I think, as soon as we realize the issue, we want to jump in and get to work and make it happen, right?
Yep.
And you know, that's often my instinct, and I do believe it's coming from good intentions. There is often, I'll just say in my experience, a bit of a gap, cultural gap between that and the very long-term, slow, speed of trust sort of way of engaging in tribal communities. So I think there's like there's a tension in this work, and I've heard it said, if it's urgent, it's not important. If it's important, it's not urgent, right? So this is a long game. This has been happening for centuries. We might want it to happen tomorrow for various reasons, including we want to see the effect of our work. But oftentimes I think there's a much larger time scale at play that I feel like the indigenous people are bringing to it and have had to, you know, had to take on in order to be as resilient and persistent as they have been.
And just one other thing, our research in terms of the lands over here in Copake Falls,
Yeah.
it's always referred to as Mohican Lenape. So those borders aren't really clear, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So, you know, there is a lot of conversation when I show the homelands map, for example. There's a lot of arguments for why that map is, again, a European notion of territories and borders. We like lines, right? We like black and white. But all of it was blurry, shifting, of course. Of course, I didn't show that as the colonies progressed into the continent, of course, peoples are being displaced. You basically have refugees. The folks that ended up in Stockbridge were not all Mohicans, but, you know, because again, Europeans liked simple definitions, they all got called Stockbridge Indians, right? So there's a huge mix and kind of that comes out of all of this. I've also been told that perhaps a more defining, let's say, relationship in terms of territories would actually be the clans. So if you look at the Stockbridge-Munsee seal, I'm probably not going to get it all right, but I think that there's definitely a turtle, a wolf, bear, thank you, and
And a turkey.
turkey, thank you. So those are different clans, and I've been told that at least up and down the East Coast, I think further, those clans existed in various tribes. And those clans were familial, and marriage, you'd marry into a clan. The men would move into the wife's clan. So you could travel up and down the East Coast navigating your clan connections, and maybe that was actually more powerful in some ways than the tribal designation. So again, it's complex, it's multi-stranded. Again, we like to think in terms of clear, definitive answers. And there's some indigenous authors that I love that say that's not a indigenous way of thinking. That there can be multiple stories that to a Western, European mind might seem contradictory, but you can see the huge diversity of people that inhabited this land. They had to hold complexity and diversity in a much bigger space than I think most of us are accustomed to today. Yeah.
Well, with Europeans, it was the men that made the decision. With the indigenous people, it was the women that made most of the decisions.
Yes. Yeah. So I just want to say, the Stockbridge-Munsee told me explicitly that they do not agree with this framing, but other indigenous folks that I work with have said, if you see a male signature on a deed, it's immediately null and void. Because just like, you know, the person in the mailroom doesn't have the right to sell the company, right? The men don't have the right to transfer ownership. So, you know, some folks would say that immediately makes it null and void. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also as our committee has discussed many times, the Native American history is not written; it's all oral, and so the idea of rewriting it or rethinking it, it becomes even more complex because nothing was written down. So now we're, you know, and whereas colonial history is very well written, so that's another complicating factor that,
Yeah.
you know, that makes things go at the speed of.
Yeah, there's a lot of cultural norms that we bring to even kind of how we view these things, what we consider valid or not valid, and we need to be aware of that so that we're not just enforcing those on folks with different views. In the back there, there's our question.
Yes, within Copake, are there known Mohican burial sites and specific village sites?
Yeah, so I've heard of documented evidence on the north side of Copake Lake. So there,
We have a map showing.
right. So there's a map here that shows a few. If I knew of burial sites, I wouldn't tell you where they are.
Well, one of the reasons.
Right. But they're
for protection.
right, exactly. So, but as I said, in 2014 there was an archaeological dig that discovered artifacts going back as far as 4000 BCE. Not burial related, but stone tools and such.
It was also what was described oddly to me as a resort, a Mohican resort on Tom's Hill.
Right. Yeah, we have no idea what that means. Apparently it was written by somebody who used dreams as a source, historical reference, which, you know, in some ways I do hope holds space for, but
It was written by an early archaeologist who was a Native American and wrote a number of books. Arthur C. Clarke, I believe.
okay.
Oh, he decided.
Yeah. So anyways, yeah, there's a lot of history here. As you might have heard, the original name for Copake Lake was Achkupik. Sometimes gets translated as snake waters. I've also heard it translated as eel waters. I've also heard that there's, you know, if you look at it linguistically, it's not clear, is it relating to referencing creatures in the water or prior to the dam, the shape of the lake. But yes, it's very clear that there's a long sustained Mohican presence here within the town. Yeah. Anyone else? Thank you so much.